Florence. Sunday, April 26th, in the year 1478 since the Nativity of Christ. Inside the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, beneath Brunelleschi's gigantic dome that seemed to float between heaven and earth, a semi-darkness reigned, pierced only by the sun's rays filtering through the stained glass windows, coloring the stone slabs in the hues of precious gems. The air was thick and sweet with incense, heavy with the whisper of 1,000 prayers. High Mass was underway. Before the altar in gold-embroidered vestments, Cardinal Raffaele Riario, the young grandnephew of Pope Sixtus IV himself, was preparing for the culmination of the Eucharist. All the city's nobility, clad in velvet and silk, stood frozen in reverent anticipation. Among them, closer to the altar, stood two brothers, the two unofficial rulers of the Florentine Republic, who were the pillars of the House of Medici. The elder, 29-year-old Lorenzo, with a face that was plain but full of intelligence and an almost animal charm, and the younger 24-year-old Giuliano, whose classical beauty seemed sculpted by the chisel of Donatello himself. No one yet knew that this Mass was a trap. No one suspected that in the shadows of the columns, among the praying townspeople, men with daggers under their cloaks lay in wait. Men whose hearts were filled not with faith, but with a black, tar-like hatred. Men whose hands were ready to stain the holy place with blood. A conspiracy, woven in the silence of Vatican chambers and in the grim palazzi of rival Florentine bankers, was awaiting its moment. And that moment had come. At the very instant the priest raised the host, and the silence was broken by the ringing of the liturgical bell. That bell became the signal for the assassins. In a single moment, the pious ceremony turned into a bloody massacre. Two men, one of whom was a priest, lunged at Lorenzo. One of them struck him in the neck, but the blade merely grazed him, leaving a shallow wound. Lorenzo, possessing lightning-fast reflexes, tore off his cloak, wrapped it around his arm like a shield, and drawing his sword, began to fight back, retreating towards the sacristy, but his brother was less fortunate. Two men attacked Giuliano. One of them, Francesco Pazzi, maddened with rage, struck blow after blow with such force that he even wounded himself in the thigh. The second, Bernardo Bandini, plunged a dagger straight into the young Medici's chest. Giuliano fell onto the cold flagstones of the cathedral, and his dark red blood, mixing with the sunbeams from the stained glass, spread across the floor, resembling blooming poppies. He was dead. Chaos engulfed the cathedral. Cries of horror mingled with the furious shouts of the conspirators who were trying to rouse the people under the slogan "Liberty." But they had miscalculated. Florence did not want a liberty bought with the blood of its favorites. The city, awakened by the toxin, exploded not in rebellion but in righteous fury. On that day, the threads of fate of all Italy were tied into a tight knot. The attempt to kill one man and overthrow one family did not liberate the Republic, but, on the contrary, drowned its last remnants in blood and forever secured the power of the House of Medici. It transformed Lorenzo from the first citizen into an almost absolute ruler, tempered his character in the fire of hatred and revenge, and marked the beginning of an era that would go down in history as the age of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This is the story of a man who was simultaneously a banker and a poet, a tyrant and a patron, a diplomat and a conspirator. A story of how, from the ashes of one of the most brutal intrigues of the Renaissance, the most splendid flower of the Italian Renaissance blossomed. A story of a golden age paid for in blood. Before the conspirators' daggers stained the marble of the Florentine cathedral, before Lorenzo's name became synonymous with splendor and power, another Medici ruled in Florence. His name was Cosimo. He wore no crown and sat on no throne, but his invisible power was stronger than any monarchy. He was the patriarch, the father of the fatherland, the man who turned a family of merchants and moneylenders into an unofficial ruling dynasty. It was he who created the complex system, the web of gold, debt, friendship, and fear that his descendants would inherit. To understand Lorenzo, one must first understand the shadow of his great-grandfather, the shadow from which he had to emerge to become the magnificent. Florence in the mid-15th century was a city of paradoxes. Officially, it remained a republic, a proud commune where power supposedly belonged to the people. Its political system was a complex mechanism, specially designed to prevent tyranny. The city was governed by guilds or arti, that is, professional corporations of artisans and merchants. Divided into major guilds like bankers, wool and silk merchants, and judges, and minor guilds, which included blacksmiths, shoemakers, and butchers. Power was in the hands of the signoria, a government of 9 priors headed by the gonfaloniere of justice. What was most striking was that their term of office was only 2 months, and they were chosen by lot from a pool of pre-approved candidates. This system of constant rotation was intended to ensure that no single person or family could usurp power. But in reality, this republican facade had long concealed the firm, though unadvertised, power of one family, the Medici. Their might rested not on swords and armies, but on a far more subtle and powerful instrument: money. The Medici Bank was the largest financial empire in Europe. Its branches, like tentacles, spread from London and Bruges to Rome and Naples. The Medici were the bankers of the Papal See. They financed kings, dukes, and condottieri. This financial leverage gave them limitless political possibilities. The founder of this system was Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo de Medici the Elder, whom grateful Florentines would later call Pater Patriae, which translates as Father of the Fatherland. Cosimo, who ruled Florence from 1434, was a genius of political intrigue. He never held the highest offices for long, preferring to act from behind the scenes, maintaining the appearance of a modest citizen. His method was simple and effective. He used the wealth of his bank to create a vast network of clients, friends, and debtors in all strata of society. He lent money to aristocrats, helped small merchants, and paid taxes for his supporters. In return, he received their loyalty. Through this network, he controlled elections to government bodies, ensuring that only the names of men loyal to him ended up in the bags from which lots were drawn. Those who dared to oppose him he destroyed not with a dagger, but with an accounting ledger. Using his influence on the tax system, he could impose such taxes on his enemies that they were driven to complete ruin, or he could fabricate charges and send them into exile. At the same time, for the common people, he was a benefactor, generously spending money on public needs. He financed the reconstruction of the San Marco monastery, adorned with frescoes by Fra Angelico, and supported Donatello, who created the bronze David on his commission. His prestige reached its zenith in 1439, when he managed to transfer the Ecumenical Council from Ferrara to the city. This event, known as the Council of Florence, brought the Pope, the Byzantine Emperor, and hundreds of high-ranking hierarchs and scholars from the Western and Eastern churches to the city. For several months, Florence became the center of the Christian world, and the influx of Greek scholars gave a powerful impetus to the study of ancient philosophy and language. Cosimo had created the perfect model of a hidden tyranny, disguised by republican traditions, but this system had one Achilles heel. It rested on the personality and authority of the ruler himself. And when Cosimo died in 1464, the Medici Empire faltered. His successor was his only surviving son, Piero, who went down in history with the nickname Il Gottoso, meaning the Gouty. This nickname spoke for itself. Piero was an intelligent and educated man, a connoisseur of the arts and a capable diplomat. but he was undermined by a severe hereditary disease, gout, a cruel illness causing excruciating pain in the joints. Often confined him to bed, preventing him from actively participating in political life, where personal presence and a show of strength were key factors for success. The enemies of the Medici, who had been quiet under Cosimo, immediately raised their heads. They saw in Piero's illness a sign of the entire regime's weakness. Soon after he came to power, Piero made a tactical error. Trying to bring order to the bank's finances, somewhat disordered by Cosimo's generosity, he demanded the immediate repayment of old debts from many noble Florentines. His father had used these debts as invisible leashes to hold the aristocracy in check. Piero, by pulling on all the leashes at once, turned debtors into enemies. This step caused a wave of discontent and led to the consolidation of the opposition. Several influential families stood at its head, but the main figure was Luca Pitti, an ambitious and vain aristocrat who had begun the construction of the grandiose Palazzo Pitti, hoping to outshine the Medici palace. In 1466, they formed a conspiracy to overthrow Piero. The conspirators secured the support of the Duke of Modena and Ferrara, who promised to send troops. The plan was to capture Piero on the road from his villa in Careggi to Florence, and it was at this moment that young Lorenzo first appeared on the historical stage. He was only 17. Learning of the conspiracy, Piero, despite a flare-up of his illness, decided to act. He sent Lorenzo ahead on the main road, while he himself, accompanied by loyal men, secretly took a side route. Lorenzo, encountering the armed men of the conspirators, showed astonishing composure. He pretended to suspect nothing and engaged them in a polite conversation about country life, delaying them and giving his father time to safely reach the city and gather his supporters. Arriving in Florence, Piero and his men armed themselves and took control of key points in the city. The Pitti conspiracy failed. Piero showed mercy to most of the conspirators, contenting himself with exiling the main culprits. This episode showed everyone that despite his illness, Piero had not lost his father's grip, and that his son Lorenzo, despite his youth, was already a force to be reckoned with. Piero understood that his days were numbered and intensively prepared his son for the role of heir. From a young age, Lorenzo was immersed in the complex world of Italian diplomacy. He went on embassies to Venice, Milan, Rome, and Naples, getting to know the rulers and studying their strengths and weaknesses. He did not receive a systematic banking education. He was being prepared not to manage finances, but to govern a state. He grew up surrounded by brilliant minds. His teachers were the best humanists of the time. He wrote poetry that placed him on a par with the best poets of the era, organized magnificent nightly tournaments where he shone with his courage and generosity, and patronized young artists. Piero cultivated Lorenzo's image as an ideal Renaissance prince, the heir not only to wealth but also to the cultural greatness of the Medici. In 1469, Piero the Gouty died. His reign was short and difficult, but he fulfilled his main task. He preserved and passed on power to his sons. Immediately after his death, about 700 of the most influential citizens of Florence gathered in the monastery of Sant'Antonio. They formally requested the 20-year-old Lorenzo to take upon himself the care of the state, as his father and grandfather had done. Lorenzo, as he later wrote in his memoirs, accepted this offer reluctantly, understanding the full weight of the burden. But this was only a formality. He had no choice. From that moment, without any official position, not being a duke or a prince, the young Lorenzo de Medici became the de facto ruler of Florence. The age of the magnificent had begun, thus power fell into the hands of a 20-year-old youth. A fragile, unofficial power contested by old aristocratic families. How to hold on to it in a city that still called itself a republic. How to rule without being a ruler. Lorenzo de Medici found an answer worthy of his genius. He decided to dazzle Florence and all of Italy with such brilliance, such magnificence, that in its radiance, any doubts about his right to rule would fade. He turned the city into a living work of art and his reign into a continuous festival. But behind the facade of carnivals, tournaments, and philosophical discussions lay a cold and calculating political machine that, with each passing year, tightened its grip on the mechanism of Florentine liberty. The era of Lorenzo's rule, especially its first half before the Pazzi Conspiracy, went down in history as the golden age of Florence. Lorenzo himself received the nickname Il Magnifico, which means the magnificent. This was not just a flattering address, but an accurate characterization of his style of rule. He intuitively understood that to hold power in a city like Florence, political intrigues and financial pressure alone were not enough. One had to win the hearts and minds of the citizens, give them a sense of participation in something great, turn their lives into a bright and unforgettable spectacle. However, Lorenzo's own appearance was far from the ideals of Renaissance beauty. He had a flattened, pockmarked face with wide cheekbones and a nose broken in his youth at a tournament, which deprived him of his sense of smell. His voice was harsh and nasal, yet all this was compensated by an incredible vivacity of mind, magnetism and charm, which all his contemporaries noted. He was equally at home at a philosophical discussion in the circle of the Platonic Academy, at a village festival singing coarse songs he himself had composed, and at a falcon hunt, to which he devoted himself with all his passion. His brother Giuliano was his complete opposite, tall, athletically built, a handsome man, a favorite of women and a hero of nightly tournaments. He seemed to embody the bright, carefree side of Medici power, while Lorenzo bore its intellectual and political burden. This duality, the combination of a refined patron and an earthy, full-of-life sybarite, was the key to Lorenzo's popularity. His main instrument was culture. Lorenzo did not just spend money on art like his grandfather Cosimo. He was its active participant, connoisseur, and inspirer. His court, though formally there was no court, became the most brilliant intellectual center in Italy. The heart of this center was the Platonic Academy, an informal circle of philosophers, poets, and scholars who gathered at the Medici Villa in Careggi. The academy was headed by the philosopher Marsilio Ficino, who, on Lorenzo's commission, translated all of Plato's dialogues into Latin, making Greek philosophy accessible to the entire Western world. Members of the circle included the poet Angelo Poliziano, one of the greatest connoisseurs of antiquity, and the young genius Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a man of phenomenal erudition who knew more than 20 languages. In their conversations, Neoplatonism was born, a complex philosophical doctrine that sought to reconcile ancient wisdom with Christian faith. The main idea of Neoplatonism was the hierarchy of beauty. According to Ficino, all earthly beauty, be it the beauty of the human body, a work of art, or nature, is merely a faint reflection, a spark of the absolute divine beauty, which is God. Thus, the contemplation of the beautiful on earth becomes a step on the path to knowing the divine. This concept allowed Renaissance man to admire ancient statues and mythological subjects without falling into the sin of paganism. The nude Venus by Botticelli was not just a seductive image, but a symbol of heavenly love and beauty leading the soul to God. Lorenzo himself, being a talented poet, actively participated in these discussions and reflected Neoplatonist ideas in his verses, which made him not just a patron, but a full-fledged participant in the cultural process. And these ideas floating in the air found their visible embodiment in the works of the artists he patronized. It was in his era that the genius of Sandro Botticelli reached its peak. His famous paintings, known as Primavera and The Birth of Venus, are not just illustrations of ancient myths, but complex philosophical allegories, a visual expression of Neoplatonist ideas. In Primavera, for example, the Garden of Venus is depicted, where under the shade of orange trees the heraldic symbol of the Medici. A drama of love and knowledge unfolds. The figures of Zephyr, Chloris, Flora, Venus, the three Graces, and Mercury represent different stages of the soul's ascent from earthly, sensual love to heavenly, divine love. Lorenzo did not just commission these paintings, he was their ideological co-author, discussing every detail, every symbol with the artist and philosophers. Besides Botticelli, Lorenzo's circle included other great masters. In the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, a young Leonardo da Vinci was studying at this time. Domenico Ghirlandaio worked for Lorenzo, in whose workshop Michelangelo Buonarroti took his first steps. Legend has it that Lorenzo noticed the talented teenager when he was copying ancient sculptures in the gardens of San Marco and was so impressed by his work that he took him into his palace, where Michelangelo lived and was raised with the ruler's own sons. Lorenzo gathered talents around him like a skilled jeweler gathers precious stones to create a magnificent necklace to adorn his Florence. He founded new educational institutions like the University in Pisa, expanded the Laurentian Library founded by his grandfather, sending agents all over Europe and the East in search of rare Greek and Latin manuscripts. But art was only one side of the magnificence. The other, no less important, was public festivals. Lorenzo turned Florence into a city of eternal carnival. He organized lavish tournaments like the one held in 1469 in honor of his wedding, where he, clad in armor worth a fortune, won the first prize. He staged theatrical processions, allegorical performances, the so-called trionfi, for which he himself wrote poems and songs. Most famous were his carnival songs, often coarse, full of popular humor, which all of Florence sang. These festivals were not just entertainment. They served an important political function. Firstly, they distracted the people from political problems and economic difficulties. Secondly, they created an illusion of universal unity and prosperity under the wise rule of the Medici. Thirdly, they were a demonstration of Florence's wealth and power to all of Italy. However, behind this brilliant facade lay a harsh political reality. Lorenzo, unlike his grandfather, gradually dismantled the remnants of republican institutions. He did not formally abolish them, but hollowed out their essence. With his marriage to an aristocrat from the powerful Roman Orsini family, Clarice Orsini, he had already shown his monarchical ambitions, as Florentine oligarchs traditionally married the daughters of their civic equals. This union was purely political and stood in stark contrast to the marriage of his parents, Piero and Lucrezia, which was based on deep affection. Clarice, raised in the stern traditions of the Roman nobility, was deeply religious and never fully understood or accepted the intellectually liberated, at times neo-pagan atmosphere of her husband's court. Her presence in Florence was a constant reminder that Lorenzo was no longer thinking in terms of a citizen of a republic, but of a European prince. He interfered in the private lives of citizens, deciding who should marry whom, who should hold what office, who should be granted a loan. His spies were everywhere. Florence had become a state where everything was controlled by one man. His foreign policy was also a reflection of his personality. He was a master of diplomacy, the needle of the Italian scales, as he would later be called, a man who with his authority and cunning maintained the fragile balance of power between the five main states of Italy, namely the Duchy of Milan, the Republic of Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. He understood that Italy's main enemy was its disunity, which made it easy prey for stronger external enemies, France and Spain. Therefore, he wove the most complex intrigues, made and broke alliances, set enemies against each other, doing everything to prevent a major war on the Apennine Peninsula. He was the first to realize the need for pan-Italian unity, albeit one based on a balance of fear. But it was this peacemaking activity and his desire to control everything that ultimately led him to the most terrible clash of his life. His ambitions collided with the ambitions of another man who also wanted to redraw the map of Italy, Pope Sixtus IV. And this collision gave birth to a conspiracy that almost cost Lorenzo his life and changed him forever. The power of the Pope in the 15th century was not only spiritual, but also quite worldly. The Pope was a monarch, the ruler of vast territories in central Italy. And like any monarch, he sought to expand his domains and enrich his family. In 1471, Francesco della Rovere ascended the throne of St. Peter under the name Sixtus IV. He was a man of boundless energy, great ambition, and most importantly, limitless love for his numerous nephews. It was his insatiable nepotism, the desire to provide his relatives with power and wealth, that would become the spark from which the flame of the Pazzi Conspiracy would ignite. And at the center of this web of intrigues was a small town in Romagna named Imola. Sixtus IV was a complex and contradictory personality. On the one hand, he was a patron of the arts. The famous Sistine Chapel was built on his commission. He reorganized the Vatican Library and attracted many artists and architects to Rome. But on the other hand, his entire policy was subordinated to one goal: the aggrandizement of the Della Rovere family. He showered his numerous nephews with cardinals' hats and secular titles. Two of them, Giuliano della Rovere, the future Pope Julius II, and Pietro Riario, became cardinals at a young age and were famous for their incredible luxury and debauchery. But the Pope's main hope was another of his nephews, a secular aristocrat named Girolamo Riario. Sixtus dreamed of creating a sovereign state for him in Romagna, a restless region that formerly belonged to the Papal States but was in fact controlled by local feudal lords. The first step towards this goal was the purchase of the town of Imola. This strategically important town belonged to the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, who was willing to sell it for 40,000 ducats. Pope Sixtus turned to his chief financial agent, the Medici Bank, for this sum. However, Lorenzo the Magnificent, upon learning of the Pope's plans, responded with a firm refusal. And he had good reasons for this. Lorenzo considered Romagna a sphere of Florentine influence. The creation of a strong, aggressive state there under the rule of a papal nephew was a direct threat to Florentine commercial and political interests. He did not want a hostile nest at the very borders of the Republic. Moreover, Lorenzo himself was negotiating to buy Imola for Florence. By refusing the Pope alone, he hoped to scuttle the deal. This was a serious miscalculation. Lorenzo underestimated the stubbornness and vindictiveness of Sixtus IV. Offended by the refusal, the Pope did not abandon his plans. He found other bankers willing to provide him with the necessary sum. And these bankers were the main rivals of the Medici in Florence, the Pazzi family. The Pazzi clan was one of the oldest and noblest in Florence, far more aristocratic than the Medici, whom they considered upstart merchants. The Pazzi traced their lineage to a knight who had participated in the First Crusade and, according to legend, was the first to scale the walls of Jerusalem. Their bank was the second largest and most influential in the city, and they looked with black envy upon the rise of their rivals. To this general envy was added a personal grievance that became the last straw. When a wealthy Florentine woman, Beatrice Borromei, died without a will, her huge fortune by law should have passed to her daughter, the wife of Giovanni Pazzi. However, Lorenzo, not wanting such a strengthening of a hostile clan, in 1477 pushed a new retroactive law through the councils he controlled, which transferred inheritances in such cases not to daughters but to nephews on the male side. Thus the Pazzi family was deprived of a colossal fortune by a stroke of a pen. This was not just a financial blow, but a public humiliation, a demonstration that the law in Florence was the will of the Medici. After this, the hatred of Francesco Pazzi, the nephew of the head of the clan, became deadly. It was Francesco Pazzi, who managed the branch of their bank in Rome, who saw his chance in the Pope's conflict with the Medici. Ambitious and hot-tempered, he convinced Sixtus IV and Girolamo that the Pazzi Bank would gladly provide the money to buy Imola. The deal was done, but this was only the beginning. In retaliation for Lorenzo's refusal, Pope Sixtus took an unprecedented step. He stripped the Medici Bank of its status as the main papal banker and transferred all the Curia's financial operations to the Pazzi Bank. This was not only a humiliating blow to Lorenzo's prestige, but also a huge financial loss. The conflict had escalated into open enmity. Now all of Lorenzo's enemies had a powerful center of gravity in Rome. In the Eternal City, in the palace of Francesco Pazzi, and in the chambers of Girolamo, a plan began to mature. They understood that as long as Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano were alive, their power in Florence was unshakable. Therefore, the brothers had to be eliminated. They were joined by another key figure, Francesco Salviati, Archbishop of Pisa. Lorenzo, considering Pisa a city in Florence's sphere of influence, had long blocked his appointment, seeing Salviati as the Pope's man. The Archbishop did not forgive this humiliation. The question of how much Pope Sixtus IV himself knew about the planned assassination remains a matter of debate. Subsequently, when the conspiracy failed, he vehemently denied any involvement in the plans for physical elimination. However, historical documents indicate that he at least knew about the conspiracy to overthrow the Medici and gave it his blessing. In a conversation with a mercenary captain, the condottiero Giovanni Battista da Montesecco, whom the conspirators tried to hire for the assassination, the Pope allegedly said that he desired a change of government in Florence, but without the death of anyone. However, he immediately added that any change of power was impossible without the brothers' deaths, and that he wished for it to happen as soon as possible. This was a cunning Jesuitical blessing that gave the conspirators a free hand. The Pope wanted results but preferred not to get his hands bloody, at least not formally. Others joined the conspiracy. The old Jacopo Pazzi, the head of the clan in Florence, long hesitated, understanding the risks, but eventually yielded to his nephew's persuasion and pressure from Rome. Assassins were hired, including two priests, Stefano da Bagnone and Antonio Maffei, who agreed to commit the sacrilege that even a professional soldier had refused. The plan was simple and diabolically cunning: to kill both Medici brothers simultaneously so that neither could organize resistance, then to incite a popular uprising and seize power. After several failed attempts to lure the brothers to a banquet, the conspirators settled on the most audacious option: to kill them right in the cathedral during Mass. They believed that the sanctity of the place and the surprise of the attack would paralyze the will of the Medici supporters. They could not have been more wrong. Their daggers were aimed at the heart of the House of Medici. But in the end, they only forged Lorenzo into the absolute ruler he had not yet been. Thus, all the pieces are set on the chessboard. In Rome, an impatient pope and his rapacious nephew. In Florence, a banker consumed by envy and an archbishop hungry for power. Mercenaries and priest assassins are ready to strike. The victims, Lorenzo and Giuliano, suspect nothing. All that remains is to choose the time and place, and this choice is striking in its cynicism and sacrilege. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. The day, Easter Sunday, the main Christian festival. But before blood is shed in the temple, the conspirators will face final, almost mystical obstacles and omens, as if fate itself were trying to stop them. The plan developed in Rome was meticulously thought out. It consisted of two parts. The first and most important was the simultaneous assassination of Lorenzo and Giuliano. The second was the seizure of the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government, the Signoria, and the proclamation of the Republic's liberation. To coordinate actions, the young Cardinal Raffaele Riario, the Pope's grandnephew who was only 17, arrived in Florence. His visit was the official pretext for gathering all key figures in one place. It was he who was to celebrate that fateful mass. The perpetrators were assigned. The attack on Lorenzo was entrusted to two priests, Maffei and Bagnone, as it was thought he would be less cautious with clergymen. The murder of Giuliano was to be carried out by Francesco Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini, an experienced adventurer mired in debt. Originally, the main perpetrator was to have been the experienced condottiero Montesecco, but he backed out at the last minute, stating that his soldier's honor did not permit him to commit murder in a church and to raise his hand against men who had shown him hospitality. His refusal forced the conspirators to hastily change their plan and involve the priests, which perhaps saved Lorenzo's life, as they were inept assassins. On Sunday morning, another hitch occurred that nearly derailed the entire plan. Giuliano de Medici, citing a pain in his knee, refused to go to Mass. This was a disaster. Without the simultaneous assassination of both brothers, the conspiracy lost all meaning. Then Francesco Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini took matters into their own hands. They personally went to the Medici palace to persuade Giuliano to come to the cathedral. Their visit was the height of hypocrisy. They joked, laughed, and on the way to the cathedral, Francesco Pazzi even gave Giuliano a friendly hug, supposedly to cheer him up. In fact, with this cynical embrace, he was checking if Giuliano was wearing a chainmail shirt or other protective armor under his clothes. Having made sure that his chest was unprotected, the conspirators were reassured. Giuliano was doomed. At the same time, Archbishop Salviati and his men headed for the Palazzo Vecchio. He was supposed to wait for the moment of the assassination in the cathedral, and then enter the building and arrest the members of the Signoria. However, his nerve failed him. He arrived too early and behaved so suspiciously that he alarmed the Gonfaloniere, the head of government, Cesare Petrucci. Petrucci was an experienced and decisive man, a loyal supporter of the Medici. He ordered the guards to lock the doors, and Salviati and his accomplices found themselves trapped inside the government palace even before the first blood was shed in the cathedral. And in the cathedral, everything was going according to the murderer's plan. The crowd of worshippers, the dim light, the singing of the choir. Lorenzo and Giuliano stood near the altar next to their friends, among whom was the poet Angelo Poliziano. Cardinal Riario began the Eucharistic canon, and then the appointed moment came, the ringing of the bell announcing the transubstantiation of the holy sacraments. This sacred sound became the signal for the assassins to act. What followed was a matter of seconds. Two priests attacked Lorenzo. Their clumsy blows only wounded him. Lorenzo, displaying incredible presence of mind, fought them off, and his friends, drawing their swords, immediately formed a tight circle around him and pushed him towards the bronze doors of the north sacristy, designed by the great Luca della Robbia. They shoved Lorenzo inside and locked the heavy doors, saving his life. One of his friends, Francesco Nori, the loyal manager of the Medici Bank, died shielding Lorenzo with his body. The attack on Giuliano was far more brutal and successful. Bernardo Bandini plunged a dagger into his chest. Wounded, Giuliano took a few steps and fell. And then the hate-crazed Francesco Pazzi fell upon him. He struck the dead body again and again with such fury that in his frenzy he pierced his own thigh. In total, 19 stab wounds would be found on Giuliano's body. Unimaginable panic erupted in the cathedral. People, not understanding what was happening, rushed to the exits. The murderers, mingling with the crowd, tried to escape. Lorenzo, locked in the sacristy, did not know if his brother was alive. He was wounded, in shock, and could only hear the screams and noise outside. His friends, fearing that the assassin's dagger might have been poisoned, insisted that one of them suck the poison from the wound. Meanwhile, in the square in front of the cathedral and at the Palazzo Vecchio, the second act of the tragedy was unfolding. Old Jacopo Pazzi, upon learning what had happened, rode into the square at the head of a detachment of his armed supporters. He tried to rouse the people, shouting slogans of the people and liberty, but instead of support he heard in reply the battle cry of the Medici supporters, "Palle, palle," a reference to the balls on the Medici coat of arms. The Florentines not only did not support the conspirators, they began to hunt them down themselves. This was not a political struggle, it was a vendetta. The people loved the Medici brothers, especially the handsome Giuliano, and the murder in a church was perceived as an unimaginable sacrilege. The fate of the conspirators was terrible. Archbishop Salviati and his men trapped in the Palazzo Vecchio were captured. The Gonfaloniere Petrucci, without much thought, ordered them to be hanged directly from the palace windows. The archbishop's body, in full vestments, dangled from a rope, swinging in the wind to the horror and delight of the crowd gathered in the square. Francesco Pazzi, bleeding from the wound in his thigh, was dragged from his palace, brought to the square and hanged next to Salviati. It is said that in his death throes the archbishop sank his teeth into Pazzi's naked body. The streets of Florence turned into an arena of lynch justice. The roar of the crowd mingled with the clang of weapons and the death cries. Anyone suspected of sympathizing with the Pazzi was mercilessly killed on the spot. The cruelty of the crowd knew no bounds. The body of old Jacopo Pazzi was first buried, but then dug up by the mob, dragged through the entire city and thrown into the Arno River. Later children would fish it out, drag it through the streets again, and hang it on the gates of his own palace. The revenge was total. In a few days, more than 80 people were killed. Lorenzo's revenge was long and unrelenting. Even Bernardo Bandini, Giuliano's murderer, could not escape retribution. He fled to Constantinople, but Lorenzo's agents tracked him down there. Sultan Mehmed II, who respected Lorenzo and wished to maintain good trade relations with Florence, extradited the killer. Bandini was brought to Florence in chains and hanged from a window of the Bargello in December 1479. There is even a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, capturing the hanged Bandini in his Turkish attire. Lorenzo, emerging from the sacristy and learning of his beloved brother's death, was crushed by grief. But he was also a victor. The conspiracy that was supposed to destroy him had made him stronger than ever. In the eyes of the Florentines, he had become a martyr who had survived a massacre, a symbol of the city standing against external enemies. This bloody lesson was not lost on him. From a cheerful and open young man, first among equals, he began to transform into a more suspicious and reserved ruler, understanding that a dagger could be hidden under the cloak of the closest friend. His power, until then based on informal agreements, was now sealed with blood and popular support. But Lorenzo understood that this was not the end, it was only the beginning. The main enemy, Pope Sixtus IV, was in Rome. And the pontiff's revenge was not long in coming. The daggers in the cathedral were replaced by armies on the battlefields. For Florence, and for Lorenzo, a war was beginning. The assassin's dagger failed to strike down Lorenzo. But now a far more terrible weapon was aimed at him, the spiritual one. Pope Sixtus IV, enraged by the failure of the conspiracy and the brutal execution of its participants, including a clergyman, the archbishop, unleashed the full force of papal wrath upon Florence and Lorenzo personally. He excommunicated them. This was not just a symbolic gesture, but a declaration of total war. A war in which two great powers of Italy, the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples, were arrayed against the small republic. Florence found itself surrounded by enemies. And to save his city, Lorenzo the Magnificent would have to make the most desperate and risky move of his life, putting everything he had on the line. On June 1st, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a bull in which he anathematized the son of iniquity and nursling of perdition, Lorenzo de Medici, and all his supporters. He accused Lorenzo of tyranny, of murdering the archbishop and other clergy, and placed all of Florence under an interdict. This was tantamount to a spiritual plague. For an ordinary 15th century Florentine whose life was steeped in religion, this meant unimaginable horror. All the churches in the city were closed. Newborns could not be baptized, meaning their souls were condemned to eternal torment in limbo. Lovers could not be married. The dead could not be buried with Christian rites, dooming them to eternal suffering. The gates of paradise, as people believed, had slammed shut before an entire city. However, Lorenzo and the Signoria responded to this spiritual war with an unprecedented act of defiance. They convened a council of Tuscan bishops, which declared the interdict unjust and invalid, as the Pope was acting out of personal hatred rather than pastoral concerns. Under pressure from the authorities, the Florentine clergy, with rare exceptions, ignored the papal curse and continued to hold services. In essence, Florence staged its own local reformation several decades before Luther, placing loyalty to the state above loyalty to the pontiff. Sixtus did not limit himself to spiritual weapons. He immediately concluded a military alliance with the most powerful and dangerous ruler in Italy, King Ferrante I of Naples, also known as Don Ferrando. Ferrante was a cruel and treacherous monarch, famous for his habit of embalming the bodies of his enemies and keeping them as trophies in a personal museum. He had long looked with suspicion on Florence's growing power and gladly seized the opportunity to weaken it. The combined army of the Pope and Naples, led by a talented commander, the Duke of Calabria, Ferrante's son, invaded Florentine territory. The Florentine Republic found itself in a desperate situation. Its own army was small and consisted mainly of mercenaries, condottieri, whose loyalty was always in question. Florence's only allies were Milan and Venice, but their help was limited. In Milan, after the assassination of Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza, a power struggle was underway and the regent Bona of Savoy could not provide significant support. Venice, a traditional rival of the papacy, was waging its own war against the Turks and did not want to get involved in another major conflict. The war, which became known as the Pazzi War, dragged on for 2 agonizing years. The papal Neapolitan troops slowly but surely advanced deep into Tuscany, capturing and ravaging towns and castles. Florence suffered from military defeats, huge expenses for maintaining the army, and the effects of the plague, which broke out again in these troubled times. Lorenzo's popularity, which had soared after the conspiracy, began to decline. Murmuring began in the city. The war was not just on the battlefields, it was a slow poison seeping into the very heart of Florence. International trade, the city's lifeblood, dwindled as papal sanctions made doing business with Florentine banks risky. The enormous costs of hiring condottieri forced the government to impose ever higher taxes, which fell heavily on both wealthy merchants and common artisans. The city, once vibrant with festivals, became gloomy and full of fear. In dark alleys and even in magnificent palaces, whispers began to be heard. Was the life of one man, Lorenzo, worth the ruin of the entire republic? Old rival families, who had been silent for years, began to test the waters, wondering if the time had come to regain their influence. Lorenzo felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He understood that he was losing not only the military but also the political war at home. He could be overthrown not by papal armies but by his own tired and frightened fellow citizens. It was this realization, along with military defeats, that pushed him to his desperate, almost suicidal Neapolitan gambit. And in the autumn of 1479, Lorenzo made a decision that astonished all of Italy with its audacity. He decided to go directly into the enemy's den, to Naples, and to meet personally with King Ferrante to persuade him to make peace. It was an incredible risk. Ferrante was famous for his treachery and cruelty, and there was no guarantee that he would not throw Lorenzo into a dungeon or simply have him killed. Lorenzo was leaving Florence, full of his hidden enemies, and placing his life in the hands of his bitterest foe. On December 7th, 1479, after writing a letter to the Signoria in which he explained that he was ready to sacrifice himself for peace, Lorenzo secretly set sail from Pisa to Naples. His journey was kept in the strictest secrecy. When he arrived in Naples, his appearance had the effect of a bombshell. King Ferrante, though surprised, received him with royal honors. Long and painful negotiations began, which lasted for almost 3 months. It was a duel of two minds, two political titans. Ferrante was an old, experienced, and cynical monarch. Lorenzo was young but already had a reputation as a brilliant diplomat. He used all his eloquence, all his charm, all the force of his logic. He did not beg or plead. He appealed to the king's cold calculation. Lorenzo argued that Ferrante was fighting not for his own interests, but for the exorbitant ambitions of papal nephews. He reminded the king of his own precarious position, as the Neapolitan nobility was known for its rebelliousness, and the French house of Anjou had still not renounced its claims to the Neapolitan throne. A long and costly war in Tuscany, Lorenzo argued, would exhaust Ferrante's treasury and weaken his army, which would be the perfect moment for an internal rebellion or a French invasion. A strong and friendly Florence, on the contrary, would be a valuable ally and a guarantor of stability on the peninsula. He backed up his words with promises of favorable trade agreements and undoubtedly generous financial offers. Lorenzo lived lavishly in Naples, hosting feasts, giving gifts, and charming the Neapolitan nobility with his erudition and generosity. He took a risk, and he won. Ferrante, who perhaps had no intention of killing him from the start but merely wanted to see the famous Florentine, eventually yielded to his arguments. He realized that Pope Sixtus was using him for his family's interests, and that continuing the war would bring Naples nothing but expense. In March 1480, a peace treaty was concluded between Florence and Naples. Lorenzo returned home a triumphator. Pope Sixtus, abandoned by his main ally, was furious but could do nothing. And soon an event occurred that forced him to finally acquiesce. In the summer of that same year, the Ottoman Turks captured the Italian city of Otranto in the south of the Apennine Peninsula. This news plunged all of Italy into terror. In the face of a common threat, internal strife had to be forgotten. The Pope was forced to lift the interdict on Florence and call on all Italian rulers for a crusade against the infidels. Lorenzo's Neapolitan gambit was a complete success. He not only saved Florence from military defeat but also raised his personal prestige to an unattainable height. He proved that he was not just the head of a banking house but a statesman of pan-Italian stature. It was after this that he definitively secured his reputation as the needle of the Italian scale, Baptiste, a wise arbiter whose word could stop wars. He returned to Florence not just as a ruler but as the savior of the fatherland. And this allowed him to finally bury the Florentine Republic. He established a new supreme governing body, the Council of 70, composed for life of his most loyal supporters. This council gained control over all state affairs from finance to foreign policy, effectively supplanting the old, popularly elected institutions. The Republic still existed de jure, but de facto Florence had become a signoria, a principality where Lorenzo was the unofficial monarch. It seemed Lorenzo had reached the pinnacle of power. He had survived an assassination attempt, won a war, pacified the Pope, and become the most authoritative politician in Italy. Florence, under his hand, shone as never before. But at the very time when the golden age of the Magnificent seemed to have reached its zenith, a shadow began to grow in Florence itself. The shadow of a man in a rough Dominican habit, with the burning eyes of a fanatic and a voice like the thunder of heaven. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. He came to the city of arts and humanism to preach repentance, and his fiery words would become the harbinger of the decline of the Medici era and the entire Italian Renaissance. Girolamo Savonarola arrived in Florence in the 1480s to take up a modest post as a lecturer at the monastery of San Marco, the very monastery that had been rebuilt and lavishly decorated with money from Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo. At first, no one paid any attention to him. His first sermons were not successful. The Florentines, accustomed to the refined eloquence of the humanists, found his speech harsh and his Ferrarese accent provincial. But Savonarola was not one to give up. Within him burned the fire of a true, fervent faith and a deep disgust for the world around him. His physical appearance was as severe as his message: short, thin, with a prominent aquiline nose, deep-set burning eyes, and large, expressive hands, with which he gestured actively as if cleaving the air and casting out demons. His sermons were true theatrical performances. He did not persuade his listeners, he conquered them. Beginning almost in a whisper, he would make the huge crowd in the cathedral hold its breath in tense silence. And then his voice would rise, reaching a deafening roar as he painted vivid, terrifying pictures of the apocalypse. Rivers of blood and the hellfire awaiting the unrepentant. He spoke not in the refined Latin of the humanists, but in the rough but powerful Tuscan dialect of the common people. He wept, he shouted, he seemed to fall into an ecstatic trance right there in the pulpit. Many in the crowd fainted from an excess of emotion. Others cried out, beating their chests in fits of public repentance. For a city accustomed to the refined, often abstract pleasures of Neoplatonism and poetry, this raw, primal experience of faith was both shocking and intoxicating. He saw around him only sin and decay. He denounced the luxury of the rich, the dissoluteness of morals, the corruption in the church, starting with the Pope himself, whom he did not hesitate to call the Antichrist. But the main target of his criticism gradually became the very essence of the Florentine Renaissance. He cursed the humanists for their fascination with pagan authors like Plato and Ovid. He lambasted artists for painting nude Venuses and Apollos, seducing the flock, and for depicting Madonnas with the pretty faces of Florentine courtesans. All this refined culture of which Lorenzo was so proud was in Savonarola's eyes nothing more than a brilliant gilding on a vessel full of filth. His sermons became increasingly popular. People flocked to the cathedral to listen to the fearsome friar. His audience changed. If at first it was simple artisans and the poor, gradually representatives of noble families dissatisfied with Medici rule, and even some humanists who had become disillusioned with their former ideals, such as Pico della Mirandola himself, began to listen to him. Lorenzo at first did not take Savonarola seriously. He saw him as just another wandering ascetic preacher. He sent delegations of respected citizens to him several times with a request to moderate his zeal and not to sow discord in the city. But Savonarola contemptuously rejected these admonitions. Legend has it that to one such proposal, he replied that Lorenzo should repent of his sins, for God would punish him and his family. Lorenzo's attitude changed when, in 1491, Savonarola was elected prior, or head, of the San Marco monastery. By tradition, the new prior was supposed to pay a courtesy visit to Lorenzo de Medici as the monastery's chief patron. Savonarola demonstratively refused to do so, declaring that he owed his election to God alone, not to Lorenzo. This was an open challenge. The monastery of San Marco, located in the very heart of the city, became a center of opposition to the Medici regime. Why did Savonarola's sermons find such a response? It was not just his personal magnetism. The end of the 15th century was a time of deep social and spiritual change. The approach of the year 1500 gave rise to apocalyptic moods and fears of the Last Judgment. The optimism of the early Renaissance was giving way to weariness and anxiety. Many Florentines, even from educated circles, began to feel that their fascination with ancient mythology and philosophy, the cult of physical beauty and earthly pleasures, had led them too far from the true Christian faith. Savonarola offered them a simple and clear path back through repentance, asceticism, and the rejection of the vain magnificence that Lorenzo personified. The economic situation in Florence was also deteriorating. The Medici Bank, once the pillar of their power, was experiencing a deep crisis. Lorenzo, absorbed in high politics, had neglected the management of the bank. Many branches went bankrupt due to risky loans granted to foreign monarchs. To cover the losses, Lorenzo was forced to dip into the Republic's treasury, which caused hidden but deep discontent. Against this background, Savonarola's sermons about divine punishment for greed and tyranny fell on fertile ground. Lorenzo's own health was also worsening. Like his father, he was tormented by hereditary gout. The attacks became more frequent and more painful. He spent more and more time at his country villas, trying to alleviate his suffering in mineral waters. The golden age was clearly drawing to a close. The bright colors of the Florentine carnival began to fade, and through them the stern, dark tones of the Dominican friars' sermons became increasingly clear. Lorenzo found himself in a difficult situation. He could not simply arrest or exile Savonarola, who enjoyed enormous popularity with the people and had the reputation of a saint. Any violence against him could provoke a riot. Lorenzo, a master of compromise, tried to find common ground with him until the very end, perhaps even feeling a certain perverse respect for the integrity and fearlessness of his enemy. But their worlds were too different. Lorenzo's world of humanistic harmony, beauty, and political pragmatism, and Savonarola's world of asceticism, repentance, and divine judgment were incompatible. It was a clash between the Renaissance and a premonition of the Reformation. In early 1492, Lorenzo finally took to his bed for good. Feeling death approaching, he retired to his favorite villa in Careggi. The doctors treating him, the best in Italy, in desperation resorted to the most bizarre remedies, including mixtures of crushed pearls and precious stones, which only underscored the powerlessness of medicine at that time against his ailment. He was surrounded by his closest friends, Poliziano and Pico della Mirandola. They read psalms to him and held philosophical conversations about the immortality of the soul. But he found no peace of mind. He was tormented not only by physical pain but also by anxiety for the future. He saw that his eldest son and heir, Piero, was a proud, short-sighted man, completely incapable of governing the state. He understood that the fragile peace in Italy, which he had maintained with such difficulty, would collapse after his death. And he could not help but hear the menacing voice of Savonarola, who was already openly prophesying the imminent death of the tyrant. The finale of a magnificent life promised to be grim. The death of Lorenzo the Magnificent on the night of April 8, 1492, was not just the end of one man's life. It was the end of an entire era. His contemporaries perceived his passing as a universal catastrophe, as a sign of calamities to come. It was said that on that night lightning struck the cathedral dome. Lions in the Signoria's menagerie roared in the vicinity, and a ghost appeared to one of the townspeople foretelling misfortune. And these superstitious fears proved prophetic. With the death of the needle of the Italian scales, the fragile balance of power that he had maintained for nearly a quarter of a century collapsed. The gates of Italy were thrown open to foreign invasions, which for the next half-century would turn the flourishing peninsula into a battlefield between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Lorenzo's last days at the villa in Careggi are shrouded in legend. The most famous of these is the story of his last meeting with Girolamo Savonarola. According to this version, Lorenzo, Feeling the end approaching and wishing to receive absolution from his most irreconcilable enemy, sent for him. Savonarola came and agreed to hear the dying man's confession, but on 3 conditions. First, Lorenzo had to attest to his strong faith in God. To this, Lorenzo readily agreed. Second, he had to return all his ill-gotten wealth. And to this, after some hesitation, Lorenzo also agreed, but the third condition was impossible. Savonarola demanded that Lorenzo restore liberty to the Florentine people. Hearing this, the dying tyrant, as the legend goes, silently turned to the wall, and Savonarola left without giving him absolution. The historicity of this scene is highly doubtful. It is more likely a beautiful parable composed later by the friar's supporters, but it very accurately reflects the essence of their irreconcilable conflict. Lorenzo died at the age of only 43, surrounded by his friends and sons. His body was transported to Florence and buried with honors in the old sacristy of the Church of San Lorenzo, next to the grave of his brother Giuliano. Later, his remains, along with those of his brother, would be moved to the new sacristy, for which Michelangelo would create his immortal sculptures, the allegories of day, night, dawn, and dusk, which became the greatest funerary monument in the history of art. The legacy of Lorenzo the Magnificent is as multifaceted and contradictory as he was himself. For some, and primarily for cultural historians, he remains the greatest patron in history, a man whose taste, intellect, and generosity nurtured the Renaissance at its highest point. He was not just a sponsor, he was a co-author of the Golden Age, the creator of the unique intellectual and artistic atmosphere in which the geniuses of Leonardo and Michelangelo could grow. He preserved for posterity the priceless treasures of ancient wisdom and inspired the creation of new, equally great ones. For political historians, his figure is far more controversial. He was, without a doubt, an outstanding diplomat whose wise policy gave Italy peace for many years. But the price of this peace was the destruction of the Florentine Republic. He usurped power, suppressed dissent, and subordinated the interests of the state to the interests of his family. He left behind not strong republican institutions, but a power vacuum that his inept son Piero could not fill. Just 2 years after Lorenzo's death, in 1494, his son would be disgracefully expelled from Florence, and French troops, the very scourge of God that Savonarola had predicted, would enter the city. And Savonarola himself would, for a short time, become the absolute master of the city. He would establish a stern theocratic dictatorship, a Christian and religious republic. The apogee of his rule would be the famous bonfires of the vanities, in which his followers, the so-called piagnoni, or weepers, would burn everything that reminded them of the brilliant and sinful era of Lorenzo. Paintings with pagan subjects, humanist books, musical instruments, luxurious clothing, and playing cards. It was a desperate attempt to turn back history, to replace the culture of beauty with a culture of asceticism. But Savonarola's rule proved short-lived. His radicalism and his constant attacks on Pope Alexander VI Borgia ultimately led him to the scaffold. In 1498, he was excommunicated, accused of heresy, hanged, and his body burned in the same Piazza della Signoria where the bonfires of the vanities had once burned. Thus, in fire and blood, ended the age of Lorenzo the Magnificent. But to destroy his legacy was impossible. The name of the tyrant Savonarola is remembered mainly by historians, while the names of the artists he cursed, Botticelli, Leonardo, Michelangelo, have become symbols of eternal beauty. Lorenzo was a man of his time, cruel, cunning, and beautiful. He was no saint, but he possessed the rarest gift, the ability to see and nurture greatness in others. He was a banker who considered his best investment not stocks and bills of exchange, but immortal works of art. And in this lies his true, enduring magnificence. He departed, and the fragile peace of Italy crumbled to dust, but the Renaissance that he had nurtured could no longer be stopped. Its rays spread throughout Europe, forever changing the face of Western civilization.